I wanted to ask you, a lot of these communities here are facing, flooding and environmental instability and, other environmental hazards. And I wanted to ask you that outside of the framework of the Paris Accords, are there ways that you think are especially effective for them to protect their environment and work towards a more climate secure future?
Look, the climate change issue is going to be one that all of us are going to have to deal with. This region, by the way, is probably as vulnerable as any to climate change because there's so many low-lying areas where, as you see, oceans rise or temperatures rise, that there's going to be an acceleration of storms, typhoons, displacement. Obviously, forest fires, just across the way, just a few years ago, you will recall, people could barely breathe for months on end in the region because the partly fires induced by the palm oil industry and the deforestation that's taking place. So this is going to be a generational project. Unfortunately, the previous generation has not handled this the way it should have. Many of you are already working on these issues. I don't think there's going to be a silver bullet. Rather, in each of your countries, you are going to have to make common cause with other leaders to find the best solutions that contribute to moving us in a better direction. So those of you who live in countries where there are still a lot of forests, finding out how you and your organization can help preserve forests, that's going to be critical. For those of you who are islanders and are experiencing the effects immediately, right now, there are going to be some hard questions in terms of adaptation versus mitigation, but as I mentioned earlier, your voice, your witness to what's happening right here and now, it is a moral call to the rest of the world, and figuring out how to tell the stories of what you're seeing and the losses that are already taking place, that's going to be important. If you live in a big industrialized country like the United States or Australia, our carbon footprint is bigger than everybody's. And so how are we trying to influence policy to reduce our carbon footprint? If you are an entrepreneur, are there ways in which you're actively participating or supporting finding solutions? Because climate change, by the way, is a good example of, remember I said earlier, sometimes your values are going to contradict each other. When I was trying to put the Paris Accords together, once we got China, I needed to get India. I talked to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister says to me, well, I've got 300 million people who still don't have electricity, who are deeply impoverished. And coal is the cheapest way for me to provide them electricity that will improve their lives. So the only way I was able to get India involved was to work with companies like Tesla and Bill Gates, philanthropists, to transfer technologies to help accelerate clean energy, because you can't expect political leaders to say, okay, we're going to sacrifice development and we're going to leave our people poor in order to save the planet. The political pressures won't allow for that. So each of us are going to have our own role to play in this process. I am still optimistic that we can slow the advancement of a warming planet. It's too late for us not to have some impacts, and so there's going to have to be some adaptation that's going to take place. The oceans will be rising, and that is going to displace people. And so we're going to have to anticipate and care for some of the consequences of that, including large-scale migration and disruptions that are going to be very costly. But there's a big difference between the ocean rising 3 feet and rising 6 feet. There's a big difference between 2 centigrade increase in temperature and 4. So even though we are going to have some problems and disruptions because of what we've already done, that shouldn't be a cause for us to then suddenly feel hopeless and not do more. And I think that there is going to be a generational element to this. Old people are not going to worry about this as much as young people because they're going to be gone when the full effects of this are felt. So you're going to have more urgency and educate your communities in ways that right now people don't think about. And that's not always going to be easy to do.
So for the people who works in the climate crisis issues, it feels like we're hitting a wall. It feels like we're losing a battle. And we just shared this yesterday. And my question to you is, what advice would you give to leaders who feels that they're losing the battle, who feels that there's no light in the end of the tunnel? Thank you.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. Number one is we have gone through in human history really bad times. Every country that you are from has history that is painful, even recent history that is painful. And I think that should be useful in giving you some sense of perspective. I've often said to groups that I meet with, particularly young people, I say, if you could choose any moment in history in which to be born and you didn't know ahead of time who you were, so you didn't know what country you were from, what gender you were, what religion, what your circumstances, were you rich, poor, you just had to kind of choose, all right, I'm the average person. When am I going to be born? Any time in human history, you choose right now. Because the truth is the world's never been, and this sounds crazy because of all the problems that we have, but the world, truthfully, has never been as well educated, as wealthy, as healthy, as tolerant. It's probably less violent than it's ever been. I mean, it's hard to remember the degrees of violence that have happened just in your parents' lifetimes, much less your grandparents' lifetimes, much less in the course of human history. I mean, we've got a strong Mongolian contingent here, right? The Mongolian president, when I was president, a wonderful guy, gave me a small book about Genghis Khan. Yeah. Now, Genghis Khan, he ruled pretty much half the world. But, you read Genghis, he didn't have a lot of politically correct tactics. I mean, it wasn't like a negotiation. You look at the history of my country in the United States. I mean, it's slavery, the removal of indigenous peoples, treaties broken, and so all of us in our recent history, terrible things have happened, and yet people overcame, worked through it, struggled, persevered, and created over time better and better and better circumstances. And then sometimes you'd go backwards, and then you'd go forwards again, right? The same thing that's true in our own lives is true for societies and is true for the planet as a whole, and that is, we take 2 steps forward, we take 1 step back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back, but the trajectory has been positive. And the best we can then do is just do our work and try to advance it as best we can, understanding that we will not finish the job. We essentially run the race, we carry the baton, then we pass it to the next runner, and the next runner goes, and they have to carry it forward. And I think it's important when you're young to feel a sense of urgency, but also to understand that's going to be, you have to feel comfortable with the fact that you're not going to solve a problem like climate change by yourself, on your own, maybe not in your lifetime. I was the President of the United States, which, you can debate, is that the most powerful person on earth? Is it, top 10? I had some clout, some juice. I cared about this issue deeply. We got a Paris Accord done. The first international framework to solve this problem over time. Even at the height of my optimism, finally getting it done, we finally signed it and everybody's celebrating, I knew that the standards that had been set by each country weren't sufficient. But I took satisfaction knowing that just by setting up the mechanism, we had created the ability to, over time, turn up the standards, turn up the demands, send a signal to businesses so that they started investing in more clean energy because they saw change coming. If I had just looked at the science at the moment I signed the Paris Accords, I would have still been despairing because it wasn't enough. But I understood, okay, we've advanced the cause, and now we're going to have to take the next step. And that's how change is going to happen. And it's not just true for climate change. If you're concerned about poverty in your country's not going to be, not poor overnight. If you're concerned about women's equality, women won't be equal in every society overnight. If you're concerned about disability rights or, anti-corruption or whatever it is, you will have more setbacks and times when you feel as if you're not making progress than those big highs when you have this big success. You just keep on going. And that's why I say you've got to be in it for the long haul and be practical in understanding where can we take some wins. Because one of the biggest dangers that happens, I saw this in my own staff when I was in the White House, sometimes people felt if we didn't get 100% of what we wanted, why bother? And they'd get very frustrated and they'd say, we can't compromise on this, we've got to get 100%. And the problem is that very rarely do you get 100% of what you want because the world's too complicated, there are too many countervailing forces. So I used to say to my staff, I said, will this make things better? And if they said yes, then I'd say, okay, let's do it. Because better is good. Most of the time, the way the world's gotten to where we are now is small incremental victories, not big sweeping victories all at once. Right? It's been the steady application of effort, innovation, new ideas, tested out, worked on a local level. A few people are helped. The ideas spread. Every once in a while, you'll get a big jump forward. But the civil rights movement in the United States, everybody thinks that somehow there was Rosa Parks, and then King made a speech, and then that was it, and we signed a law. I mean, people, even setting aside slavery and the Civil War, people have been working for decades filing lawsuits, and they had trained Rosa Parks so that when the time came, she knew she should be sitting in the bus, and there were lawyers already prepared with the case to test it out. And right, I mean, that was the work of generations, and it's still not complete. So you can't be discouraged. You should take a day off if you feel too discouraged. You know, right? Relax. All right.